Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. We are continuing our counter-programming for the most part. So we're not going to be talking about a lot of stuff on the news today, but we are going to be talking about stuff that really, really matters with two colleagues of mine from the American Enterprise Institute. And while many of you know me as a pseudo-intellectual demi-Jew from the Upper West Side of Manhattan, we actually have some bona fide eggheads on here today. Ben and Jenna Storey are the Ravenel Curry Chairs in Civic Thought and Senior Fellows in Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. They are also the co-directors of this new thing that keeps using up all the Wi-Fi at AEI called the Center for the Future of the American University. Ben and Jenna Storey were longtime for real academics in the university, and then they came for think tank life. My understanding is they did it mostly for the free lunches. And anyway, they're here to join us to talk about liberal education and civics and why we can't have nice things anymore. So, Storeys, thank you so much for being here.
Jonah, thank you for referring to us as bona fide eggheads. That's a title that I've been aspiring to for a long time. And I finally acquired it here on the Remnant podcast.
You guys didn't actually go to Chicago at the same time as Yuval, did you?
We actually did. Yuval was in my class at the University of Chicago, and Ben was our senior colleague there. He was a year above us.
So, Yuval Levin, very popular on this podcast. Have him on all the time. He's also technically our boss. So, not only is he a handsome man, he's a powerful man. But if you have any embarrassing stories about him in college, we will give you as much time as you need on this podcast to get into them. And why don't you noodle that, let it percolate in the back of your head, and maybe towards the end, if you say, oh, that time with the lampshade and the cow, that would be awesome. But until then, why don't you sort of explain why you left? I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, when we first came to AEI, I could see that there was a lot of excitement in the building that we were going to, get Yuval to go out and party. But I'm sorry to deliver the disappointing news. That was really hard to impossible to do, even when he was 25. So I don't think he's going to do it at this point. We keep trying.
Yuval partying means an extra Diet Coke. Okay, so why don't we start with sort of why you came to AI and why you founded this new Center for on the Future of the American University?
Yeah, well, thanks, Jonah. So Jenna and I came to AEI. We were on sabbatical. We thought we were just going on a little field trip from our work as liberal arts college professors down at Furman University. We've been in the academy for most of our adult lives, and we were in a political science department. And it struck us that I've been in a political science department at that point. I've been in a political science department for 17 years, and I'd never been anywhere in the actual proximity of politics. And so this seemed like a hole in my education. And, maybe we ought to remedy that by coming to DC and finding out how people live in this world. But when we got to AEI, we discovered the possibility of doing a different kind of work here that spoke to something that was really profound in us. So Jen and I were teachers of the liberal arts. We loved doing that work. We loved working with students. But from the very beginning of our academic careers, we've also been academic reformers. And this goes back to something sort of very deep in our formation, back to our Chicago formations. Jenna dug up a really nice remark from Lawrence Kimpton, who was the president of the University of Chicago, after Robert Maynard Hutchins, back in the several decades ago. And Kimpton said, comparing Chicago people, Harvard people, and Yale people, he said, a Harvard guy walks into a room and he acts like he owns the place. A Yale guy walks into a room, he acts like he doesn't care who owns the place. A Chicago guy walks into a room and he starts rearranging the furniture. And that has always been a fascination for Jenna and I, is the arrangement of the furniture of intellectual life. We've always wondered about the way the disciplines are organized, the way the hierarchies that exist inside the university. But when you're actually on a university campus, you have very limited range of action with respect to those things. You've always got to worry about the guy down the hall problem. That is, maybe you want to start a program in this area or that area, but the guy down the hall thinks he owns the word ethics. And are you really going to sort of spend all your limited political capital trying to overcome that guy in that particular territorial fight? At a place like AEI, we're still working with university administrators, university trustees, lots of university faculty from all over the country, but we are no longer involved in the territorial conflicts of a particular university campus. So we can think about rearranging the furniture in terms of what American intellectual life needs right now. And that's what we're trying to do with the Center for the Future of the American University.
Yeah, I'll just add that, if you don't mind me adding to Ben's comments, which I typically do, that we have really great colleagues at AEI, yourself included. It's terrific. We gather with a lot of them on Friday afternoons to read things, and it's just an incredible privilege to be able to do that. We also had good colleagues in the university, but it's really nice not to be so focused on your colleagues all the time, which is the case in the think tank world. University life is really insular. You're very focused on the opinions of your peers, your departmental peers, because they're crucial to your hiring and advancement, and your disciplinary peers because they're crucial also to your hiring and advancement, whether you're going to get published. And that cultivates a certain kind of thinking. It can be really fun and nerdy and kind of, detailed, but it also doesn't really exercise the ability to speak more generally. And look at the big picture. And I think if social thought trains for anything, it trains generalists. It trains people who like to write for broader audiences, and we get to do this at AEI.
Yeah, I mean, I'm truly a creature of AEI. My first real job out of college, when I got back from teaching English in Prague, was as a researcher at AEI, and with a few departures, most of my life I've been in its orbit or physically there in one way or another, and I'm very proud of the place, particularly given we're not supposed to curse on this podcast, so the Fecal Festival that is the Heritage Foundation these days, it makes me very proud of the leadership of the institution and how it handles things. But let's talk about academia for a second. So, one of my intellectual peeves, or maybe it's my editorial peeves, is I hate the way people use the word oligarchy, because they think oligarchy means rule of the rich when it actually means rule of the few. And the actual iron law of oligarchy I find very, very persuasive. The Robert Michels essay, and basically, and there's a reason why I'm bringing this up. His basic argument is not that we are in a vicious, cruel Nietzschean universe where the strong few will rule us all. His point is that in any organization, the people who can control the flow of information and have special insider knowledge about how the institution works will, over time, accrue greater and greater control over the institution, not out of some sinister scheme, but just that's the way bureaucracies work, right? And what I find fascinating is that there are very few places that better prove the iron law of oligarchy than American higher education, where the person who has the clipboard about who gets the right classroom at the right this time, or who gives out the parking spaces, right? That these people rule in ways that sort of demonstrate how control of bureaucratic resources and inside information gives you outsized power. And this is not an insight that should be surprising to any academic in the world, and yet so many universities are poorly run because of fundamentally this problem. And so I'm just like, first of all, am I right? But second of all, why? What do you think is the cause of so much dysfunction. I'm not talking about an ideological thing. I'm just talking about, like, it's just hard to get crap done at universities, and they're so slow to move.
Well, Jonah, so we've got, for the Center for the Future of the American University, we've set up what we're doing in terms of 5 pillars: liberal education, civic education, university governance, viewpoint diversity, and science and society. And your question points to the question of university governance. And a lot of our university governance institutions can be dated back to 1915 and the AAUP, the founding of the AAUP, and its initial document on tenure and academic freedom. And at the time, professors were like legitimately worried about major encroachments from wealthy people on the boards of universities, political figures really pressing, for example, university presidents to fire faculty when they didn't like what they were saying. So the AAUP, forms this professional organization of scholars that undertakes a successful effort to endow professors with an extraordinary kind of power. There are very few organizations in which people hire their peers, which is what faculty get to do. And so the protections that were created at that time, in a lot of ways, they're really necessary. I could be, sympathetic with what the AAUP was up to at the moment of its founding. But the thing of it is, the way that this worked was to create a structure that protected professors from outside forces, but left them totally vulnerable to inside forces. As a faculty member, you are one of the most opinion-dependent people in any profession, right? The opinions of your professional colleagues are gold to you. That stuff totally controls your ability to advance in your area of study. And so that begets a lot of the dysfunction that we see in higher education now. And so it is exactly a problem with the kinds of information flows that you're talking about. The networks by means of which who reviews what book gets decided by a university press, or who reviews what article gets decided by the governing board of an important journal. And so a lot of what we want to try to do right now is to actually try to help rethink those structures, which is not an easy problem. When you see the kind of dysfunction that I've described, a lot of people from the business or political world will look at that and say, look, we just need to run the university more like a business. We just need to make this more of a sort of top-down operation with a CEO and so on and so forth. I don't really think that's the solution, or at least not the whole solution, in the sense that expertise really does have an important role to play in deciding what gets studied at a university. The problem is right now, at least in certain circumstances on university campuses, faculty have so much power that they undermine themselves. That is, in precisely the way that you're describing, in their construction of what it is that gets studied and taught on university campuses. And that needs to be reformed. But it needs to be reformed thoughtfully and carefully so as to actually do the proper work of the university better.
So everyone, you constantly hear, and I have very strong opinions about this, so you hear it from me too. But we hear all the time that civics education is in crisis. I think that's, depending on what people mean by it, I think that often is true, but sometimes what people mean by it I don't agree with, so I have to say that sometimes it isn't true. Is it in crisis? And not just what isn't. One of the things that bothers me about the discourse is a lot of people talk about what isn't taught, and that includes me. I get very annoyed by what isn't taught. But there's also stuff that is taught that strikes me as stuff that shouldn't be taught, or at least it shouldn't be taught to the exclusion of the stuff that should be taught. So why don't we just sort of do a level setting? What is the state of American civics education today? And then I have a follow-up question on it.
Okay, well, I'll take that first. I guess I do think that you could make the argument that we haven't been focusing on civics as a country in the last several decades. Danielle Allen brings up the point that we spend as a country $50 on STEM education to every 5 cents we spend on civics education. Even granted that we don't need, semiconductors or something like that to do civics, that's still a big gap, and that kind of indicates where we think our priorities are. I think in the university, which is really where we concentrate, you see civic education coming in and out of focus over the course of, say, the last 100 years. It's not really a natural part of the modern research university, largely because the modern research university privileges like the scientific view or the perspective of a neutral observer, and not really the perspective of the human being and citizen, not really the perspective of like the person that's embodied somewhere, right? That might be a citizen, among other things. So I think you see, if you look at the history of the American university since like 1876 or so, you see civics like sometimes coming into the focus when the country is panicked about itself falling apart, and then other times just kind of evaporates or just becomes very diffuse. I think we're actually in a moment right now where people think our country is falling apart, and so they're pouring a lot of energy and resources into university level civic education, and that's a really good thing. And it's a great opportunity because it gives people the chance to think about, as you say, what should be taught as part of this and how the teaching should be structured. We've been involved in the curricular development and in a lot of conversations with the new schools of civic thought that have been launched in a big way in public universities, mostly in red and purple states, and then also talking with people who are doing civics in private universities about that and their approaches. And we think this is an opportunity to really, hopefully, root civics in the university curriculum, in part by expressing it as something that's really worthy of the highest level of thinking and the deepest forms of research, as well as something that should be pedagogically available to all students. So I think it's actually, in a certain way, a good opportunity for civics right now. But we'll see what can be made of this moment.
So just to piggyback a little bit on what Jenna is saying there, universities cultivate lots of different kinds of excellence. You can become you can get practice in creative writing on university campuses. You can get practice in conducting an orchestra on a university campus. You can become a scholar on university campuses. There are all and lots of kinds of scholars. You can become a biologist or an English scholar. You can become you can acquire all kinds of intellectual excellence. One of the things that we've been thinking about a lot is the particular intellectual excellence that citizenship aims at. That is, thinking well as a citizen is actually a really challenging thing to do and can be potentially a very high level thing to do. And you can see it in its distinctiveness when you think of what it means to make the judgments that citizens are called upon to make. We go in the voting booth. What do we judge? We judge how the whole project is going, right? Like, are our leaders leading us well right now, or do we want a change? That means we're considering the whole range of things that our polity is engaged in. That is, we're considering, do we like this president's Supreme Court nominations? Do we like this president's environmental policy? Do we like the fact that this president is, bombing this country or not bombing that one? We're asking all those kinds of questions as citizens. That's the intellectual muscle that we're called upon to exercise. And those are the muscles, you might describe them as of a disciplined generalist. That is, somebody who is thinking about a very broad range of questions, but is thinking about them in a responsible way. That is, if you're in a position of political responsibility, you actually have to answer for the thing that you're trying to lead. And as citizens, we are all, in a certain sense, in a position of political responsibility. And so that perspective is a prudential and holistic perspective. You can think of this like, if you think of the example of the COVID-19 crisis, when you try to respond to a crisis like that as a political thinker, you should be taking in information from all different kinds of sources, all different kinds of experts. You should be listening to public health experts, economists, education experts, lots of different people to form your opinion about things. But you're not one of the experts if you're in a position of political responsibility. You're somebody who takes in all that expertise and then comes to some kind of comprehensive judgment. And so that's a very challenging kind of intellectual exercise. And it's something that universities can give young people practice in attempting to exercise by giving them an education that is actually directed toward cultivating those kinds of faculties. And it's also something that can be done at a really high level. And you see what it looks like when it's done at a really high level, particularly at a place like AEI, where we have lots of scholars who write for the general public. They're not just writing for little audiences of experts. They write in a way that makes themselves publicly intelligible. They try to write in a responsible way. And they show that this can be a really serious intellectual discipline. So we think that's something that's really missing in the contemporary university, and we're really glad to see it being rebuilt. As Jenna said, in part in these red and purple state projects that have been springing up around the country, but now starting to penetrate the elite private higher education with projects underway at places like Stanford and Johns Hopkins. And so, in that sense, there's something really good going on in the world of civic education these days.
So I like and agree with a lot of what you said here, and as a jack of all trades, master of none generalist, I appreciate the nod to the importance of being a generalist and a popularizer. That said, when you were talking, I went back in my head and was like, wait, did I ask him what the liberal arts are, or did I ask him what civics are? Because it sounds a lot like what you're describing as the liberal arts, not so much what most people think is civics. I'm happy to concede that whatever the definition of civics is and whatever the definition of liberal arts is, the Venn diagram is going to have a lot of overlapping shaded area. But isn't there a difference between civics and liberal arts?
I'll say one quick point of historical detail on this. Socrates in Plato's Gorgias describes himself as the one person to actually put his hand to the political art of his time. He describes himself as the one serious statesman in Athens. And a lot of people, Jonah, in the Straussian world, will take that as very ironic. Oh, Socrates, he's having a nice little joke on us and these kinds of things. I think he's totally serious. I think he is totally serious in the sense that Socrates recognizes in that comment the magnitude of the extraordinary intellectual demands that the efforts to govern ourselves make. To govern yourself, to be sovereign, like American citizens are sovereign, is to have judgment over everything that the polity does. There's not a law that we have, not even our Constitution, that we can't revise if we choose to change it. That means we really do have superintendence over the whole. That's an extremely demanding intellectual responsibility. I think it's the intellectual responsibility that Socrates trained himself for. And so in this sense, I think the overlap between civic education and liberal education is much more extensive, frankly, than I was taught in some of my graduate school classes on political philosophy.
Yeah, I think you see that as well if you look at Cicero's explanation of what liberal education is, and he's the first person to have the term land in a document we still have. So he may have come up with it, or he may be articulating what people were talking about at his time. But anyway, Cicero talks about liberal education as the art of living as a free person. And that includes the art of living as a responsible citizen, right? It's broader than that, but it definitely includes the art of living as somebody that has a share of responsibility for your community and your country. I think, as Ben was saying, we've overly dichotomized what liberal education and civic education mean. Kind of simplify. Often we think of civic education as like pouring ideas in, and liberal education is like unpacking and questioning those conventional opinions. And as we've come to think about this question of how liberal and civic education relate, or even what liberal education really is and what it did for us, we've come to think that this is misleading.
Right. Okay. Fair. But let's put it this way. When I think of liberal arts, things like 19th century romantic poetry fall in there. Things like, the history of the Peloponnesian War or the 100 Years' War or all that kind of stuff. When I think of civics, I don't necessarily think of those things. I mean, there have to be some things in. I take your larger point, but there have to be some things that where the Venn diagrams don't overlap to some extent, right? Or is it? Or do you really do think they're just simply synonymous terms?
No, we don't think they're. Sorry, Jenna, why don't you go ahead?
Well, I just try out the idea that civics is a subset of liberal education. perhaps. I think a liberal education,
Okay.
if it's meant to be the art of living as a free person, also includes the art of living in a lot of ways that aren't immediately about the self-governance in a collective sense, right? So they could be about making decisions about your family life, your career, and things like this, right? Now, all of those are shaped by the civic experience. So it gets, one gets into the question of the way the Venn diagrams may overlap, or if that's the right way to describe it. But that would be my initial answer.
Jonah, I think one way you can think about it is as follows. On the one hand, when you're studying 19th century Romantic poetry, to take your example, you're just studying poetry. And you're wondering, what's the rhyme scheme here? How many beats are there in this line, and these kinds of things. And those are not directly civic questions. On the other hand, our government includes something called the National Endowment for the Humanities. Our multi-layered government includes all kinds of educational enterprises in which the humanities are included. And in that sense, what the humanities are and why they matter is in fact a civic question, right? If do you think we should have a national endowment for the humanities or not? Do you think we should study poetry in our primary education system, in our secondary education system, or not? And this is, Aristotle has this interesting remark where he says that in some ways prudence is the highest science, and in some ways it's not. In some ways theory is the highest science. Why is prudence in some ways the highest science? Prudence is in some ways the highest science because human beings are mortal. We're involved in practical life. We're constantly having to make decisions. And those decisions include our civic decisions about, for example, what the young should study. So in this sense, the civic art really is very comprehensive because we're constantly making those kinds of decisions together.
All right, so I warned you guys that rabbit holes and digressions are permitted here. When Jenna talks about, when you talk about the Cicero is the first to refer to liberal education, at least that we know of, right? One day we're going to find the remains of the Library of Alexandria, and it's going to be awesome to ruin everybody's careers. And it's partly because I'm going down a rabbit hole on this for a project that I'm working on. The word liberal there kind of cuts both ways back then. So it is education for a free person, but the definition of a free person was a highly contextualized aristocratic person, and libertas has a connotation of the generosity of the patriarch of a clan kind of thing, and it wasn't necessarily the education for the little people, right? It was the education for the elites who had in Greek or Roman society the resources and the agency, right? I mean, there's all this talk in ancient, I know Cicero's Roman, but like in ancient Greek, we get the word idiot, and it doesn't mean, moron, it doesn't mean Jesse Waters on Fox News or anything. It means the person lacking the knowledge subsets and interest in politics to be a useful citizen for the purposes of politics, right? There are a lot of people out there who, I'm not calling them idiots in either sense, but for whom the liberal arts education on their own terms is kind of lost on them, right? And that there's a certain amount of inherent elitism in the whole idea of going to college. First of all, most people don't go to college, and there is a certain amount of, it's a bit of a Veblen good to care about some of these things. Now, that doesn't really bother me, but I think it bothers a lot of people. I think the barrier to entry should be whether you care about it, right? Or whether it shouldn't be like, only rich people should be able to do liberal arts. It should be only people who really care about liberal arts should do liberal arts. But that doesn't apply necessarily to, in my mind, to civics, which is why I keep harping on the difference. And maybe it's just that I find that, I'm a syndicated columnist, so according to union rules, once every 5 years, I have to write a column about how Americans have no idea how their government works, right? And there's some poll out that shows that only like 30% can name, the three branches of government, or they don't know what the Supreme Court does. I mean, there are those things, and they make you want to cut yourself and all of this kind of thing. Then you meet a lot of people who don't know these things, and it turns out that they're really great citizens and great people, and they have full realized moral lives. But anyway, the point I would make is that so much of the stuff that I mean by civics, the Civics 101 stuff, should be taught in high schools, right? Or even elementary schools. And just like a lot of schools are now doing remedial literacy stuff and remedial math stuff, it feels like a lot of stuff that I see on a lot of college campuses about civics, to the extent I see any at all, and I used to visit a lot of college campuses, is basically cleaning up the mess that was passed along by the K through 12 people. Anyway, I'm not sure what my exact question here is, but this, I don't think we can have a country where everybody is expected to. I love the liberal arts, and I want anyone who really is interested in it to pursue it, regardless of class, in a very Jeffersonian kind of way. But like, we're not going to have that country, right? There are some people who they wanted to get a degree in STEM and go make widgets and thingamabobs, and I'd like them to know a little bit more civics. I don't expect them to know a lot more liberal arts. Am I just being a Neanderthal?
I don't know. I do think that if we look at civics as something that belongs only in K-12, and if it's taught in the university, it's going to be something remedial, then it will never get taught in the university or K-12, because teachers in K-12 are trained in the university, right? And if people in the university aren't inspired to take up civics, as we're calling it, or civic thought, as we like to call it, as something that's really exciting, which it actually is, then it will never get transferred in a meaningful way to teachers in K-12, right? And I also think, you bring up the fact that few Americans understand even the basic facts about how our government works. And it's worth asking, both whether they're taught, but also why, if they're taught, why those facts don't stick. Because I would guess that many people encounter them in passing at some point in K-12, right? But they don't remember them. Yeah. And they don't remember them because they're not meaningful, right? I mean, that's often why someone doesn't remember something. Things stick with you when you understand why you had to learn them, right? So not only why you have to learn them because you're a citizen, but also like why they're there in the first place. Like, why do we have a Supreme Court? Why does the Supreme Court have the powers it has? You're most likely to remember details about the Supreme Court if you understand something of why it was designed in the first place, or how it's evolved, something appropriate to your level, right? But I think civics, even in K-12, should be taught that way.
Two quick follow-up points there. First, on what Jenna's saying about civic education. We've proposed, and some of the new schools of civic thought are sort of moving this way, that the first course in a civic thought major, if you call it that, ought to be called "Can We Govern Ourselves?" In other words, it ought to be a course that looks beyond the United States at the whole project of human self-governance, and the number of times and the variety of ways in which that project comes a cropper. That is, human beings, we need to begin by understanding that governing ourselves is hard, that it often fails. And when we understand that as the background of the American civic project, then we can begin to understand some of the things that Jenna was saying. Like, why do we have judges with lifetime appointments? Why do we have a bicameral legislature? If you're looking for like simple, obvious justice, a lot of these things don't make any sense. And that's where we're at in our country right now. People are really frustrated because they can't see simple, obvious equality and justice in a lot of our institutions. But that's because our institutions are designed not to be simple, and they're designed not to be simple because the simple ways don't work. But you only know that if you've actually studied what happens when you have people debating questions of war and peace in the public square, and actually making the decisions as they did in ancient Athens. So in that sense, I think it's really important not to just do how a bill becomes a law, although I think that's really great. And I want people to know that stuff. I think they need to know how a bill becomes a law in this weird Rube Goldberg project kind of way. In our system, because lawmaking is a really kind of breathtaking exercise when you really think it through. And you really only understand that when you look at how people have done this over the course of time. Jonah, to your point about whether everybody needs to be liberally educated, look, I think you're certainly right that there are lots of good people, lots of wise people who don't have any formal college education or these kinds of things and live really remarkable American lives. And so, I don't think Jenna and I have any desire whatsoever to put that kind of thing down. At the same time, America has democratized liberal education like no country in the history of the world. The story of the American university in the 19th century is a story of half-educated preachers riding off into the wilderness with their Cicero under one arm and their Bible under the other, and setting up colleges like Grinnell and Oberlin to bring liberal learning to the backwoods. And this is a really remarkable American thing, a really remarkable American achievement that is profoundly under threat at the moment. That's the heart, in my view, of the controversy over the university at present, is that Americans no longer believe in the desirability of something like a liberal education. And that's really sad, because that's the abandonment of a really important American birthright that actually precedes our Declaration and our Constitution. And so that's one of the projects of the Center for the Future of the American University, is to try to rebuild this hope in the liberal arts, which means giving a different case to the liberal arts.
You said a few times, and I get grief for using this word a lot on this podcast. Directional. I think you're directionally right. I agree with you directionally about almost all of this stuff. But when you said a few times, when people go into the ballot box to vote, right, and they have to bring in all of this knowledge from all of these different things. I don't write about it as much these days, because given the post-2020 election context, it sounds like I'm lending aid and comfort to people I do not want to lend aid and comfort to. But I've long argued that it should be harder to vote. I don't want poll taxes. I don't want any of that kind of stuff. But we have so lowered the barrier to entry to voting, and there's still people who, it was Swalwell or somebody recently was talking about how we should be able to vote on our phones, which is this idea that has been kicking around for 25 years. I think that is preposterous. And anyway, I don't want to get into a big argument about voting. We can engage however you want on it. But the reason I bring it up is I've long argued that voting should be further along the road of civic engagement. The argument from the sincere, decent people who hate my arguments and want voting to be as maximally easy as possible, they make the argument that it gets people to care about their country. It is the gateway drug for civic engagement. You'll hear that kind of language, right? It turns people into citizens and stakeholders, and it makes them interested in all this kind of stuff. And I get the argument. I just disagree with it. And it seems to me that making it easier to vote in the way that some people want, online voting, vote by your phone, endlessly open months of absentee or at-home voting, makes it easier. It makes voting more commodified and less something that you guys are the academics. I think you guys know better than I do, but I'm a journalist, so maybe I know better than you do. Deadlines are kind of important, right? Deadlines focus your mind.
I don't know that at all.
Yeah. And so if you don't have a deadline, no term, they're only 1% of your students will ever write a term paper 3 weeks in advance, 5 weeks in advance, right? Just not how our brains work. We need the consequence to come up on us. And the more rolling we have the deadlines for voting and all of this, the more it's the kind of thing that you put between dropping off your dry cleaning and picking up your kids from school, rather than something that you're focusing your mind and thinking about from the same set of facts. And so the specific question I have is, let's just stipulate that I'm somewhat correct on this. We can argue about voting another time. What are some other ways for a modern citizen to actually exercise their agency as a self-governing sovereign citizen that gets them engaged in the process? Because one of the great weaknesses of my point of view is, what else do you want them to do, right? I mean, like, go to a town hall meeting, go to a city council. I mean, like, there aren't a lot. We are a self-governing people without a lot of mechanisms to feel like you're doing a lot of self-governing. So, like, what would be your response to that?
Well, I think you're right that if you're saying that there's with this last remark, that you're saying that there's an overemphasis on voting as the kind of gold standard of civic engagement, that has been a pet peeve of mine for a long time. And I've recently found out, why that, one reason why that might be the case on college campuses, which is decades ago when people started to try to measure the efficacy of certain civics programs at that time, they landed on voting, the percentage of students who vote, as a convenient measure for that question, because it can be
it's a measurable measure,
so
right?
forth. It's a measurable measure,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
I've talked to people that have been we're working in that. They're like, oh, we never meant this to be the whole thing, but so often, of course, the easy thing becomes the whole thing, right? So
right, you get what you measure, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I agree with you that voting is often not a tremendously meaningful experience, and not the most meaningful experience usually of civic life. But I guess I do think that, and maybe this is because we love Tocqueville and then we tend to see America in through his eyes. I mean, I do think that this is a country that has a lot of associational life, even now. If you compare it to at least the other countries I've lived in, Germany and France, I think Americans are always, they tend to get together to do things, in kind of often ad hoc or semi-organized ways. So that brings you out of your familial context and, causes you to work with other parents to allow your kids to join a swim team and carry water for them and time their laps and things like this. And I do think even that sort of it's actually, I find that particular activity kind of difficult and challenging, and but it does make me contribute to think about how to organize this thing, participate in that, and contribute to some kind of larger civic good. So I think there are many ways to. I would actually say there are a lot of ways to get involved in civic life in America.
So we once knew a young French person who came over and stayed with us for a little while, was studying our children's classical school, which she was interning there, and was very inspired by this. And she wanted to go back to France and start a classical school when she left America. But she got back to France and was just quickly defeated by the barriers to doing that kind of thing in the United States. Jen and I have been involved now in a couple of startup school projects. And that's one of the things that really makes me love this country. Is if you don't, we had to, we didn't start this, but some of our neighbors down in South Carolina, when we were living down there, they didn't like the available educational options in Greenville, South Carolina, despite the fact that actually some of those options were pretty good. But they thought, no, this is what I really want for my kids. And so they started a new school in their living rooms. And it grew to become something really wonderful. And that is a distinctive kind of American possibility. But it's only through the exercise of those kinds of possibilities that we actually come to understand, I think, in part, what a great country this is, because that is a lot of our greatness, is the capacity to build lives with our friends and neighbors like this that are really meaningful. You're not told what to do from the top, but you get to figure it out. And we think a liberal education, to return to our main subject, is really helpful for doing that kind of thing, because the people that we're describing who have been involved in these school building projects, a lot of them have a profound vision of what they think an education ought to be that came to them from some really powerful educational experiences. And they want to instantiate that in the lives of their kids. And so in that sense, yeah, I think these kinds of civic experiences are really important to what it means to be in America, and are actually more involved with things like liberal education than we sometimes understand.
Yeah, it's kind of funny, actually, with that, the good examples, Ben. And I think that there's a kind of paradox here, because it's often discontent with what America currently offers that drives people to go, invent these things, found these things, and innovate. And but the condition of their ability to build things like new schools is actually what America offers, right? Like this country really does make that much more easily possible than many other countries. And it allows, in the best sense, your kind of discontent can turn into a kind of gratitude in that way.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. It's funny. Just yesterday, I was in a bit of a Twitter badinage with to keep this thing elevated. There's someone had posted a chart about how unbelievably difficult it is to hire and fire in France. And I chimed in that I knew, and it's a true story. I knew a guy 30 years ago when I was a documentary maker, and I was over there for a project, who his real business, he owned a trucking company, and he was like, "I'm sorry I'm late for this dinner that we had to go to." He's like, "I'm sorry I'm late. I had another hearing. And he explained that he'd been trying to fire a truck driver who drove drunk, missed work because of his drinking, and he was like in the third round of having to prove he had a good reason to fire this person." And I told a short version of the story on Twitter, and it was interesting. I heard back from a bunch of European people saying, "Well, look, there are horror stories everywhere, but of course the burden is on the employer to show that he's firing someone for a good reason." And I was like, actually, I don't think I agree with that. I think if you think you were wrongfully fired, the burden is on the fired person to prove that it was for some reason other than the fact that you're a drunk driver or whatever. But like, if you're fired because you're black or you're gay or you're Jewish or whatever, okay, like bring that evidence. But like, and it's such a profound cultural difference about how in America we still have that thing that says if we want to start something, someone has to come up with a good reason for why we can't.
Yes.
Right. And that, I think, is a huge part of the American character that, because fish don't know they're wet, a lot of Americans are blind to.
Yeah, this is something that we discovered ourselves only, I think, because of our experiences in Europe. As is the case with many people, you don't really understand what it means to be an American until you leave America, and then this comes profoundly back to you. Yeah, and so I think that the discovery of Americans' hopeful character, for example, and that is something that we only really discovered over there. I want to put in a small note, simply not to France bash too much. I love France. We wrote a book about the French tradition of moral philosophy, which is a really wonderful thing. There's a reason that a French guy wrote the best book about America, in Democracy in America, is because he had this French tradition to learn from. So that, by the way, to all my French friends out there listening to this podcast, I wanted to simply bow in the direction of a lot of what they've given us.
Yeah, and I think Europeans some Europeans fantasize about America as a kind of Wild West. Everything is possible here. I remember driving with some German friends, and we pulled over to the side of the road. We're looking to, go out or something for dinner, and we pulled up in a sign that said "Kein Parkplatz," no parking, and they were like, "You would never see this in America." I'm like, well, it's not that wild and free here. We do have some rules. So some of this is also more seriously, this ability to innovate is always threatened here too, as well, right? People are always trying to regulate things. And
that's sort of how it started with the iron law of oligarchy thing. Is like the people who actually understand the term the most are the most inclined to abuse, its insights. Since we dragged de Tocqueville into this, I'm kind of curious what you guys think about. So our friend Yuval, he likes to point out that in Democracy in America, Tocqueville does in effect a history of liberalism that doesn't even mention the Enlightenment, and this is something I've been spelunking in this rabbit hole for the last few weeks for my own purposes. But it is very strange that we are in a moment in America where, there's been a version of anti-liberalism and post-liberalism on the left for a very long time. I mean, I keep pointing out to people, Marx was the first really post-liberal guy, right? He's like, literally, it's his theory is that the bourgeois revolution is useful, accumulates wealth, and then we're going to move beyond it and leave it in the dustbin of history, right? And there are a lot of offshoots of Marxism that are post-liberal or anti-liberal in the context that we're talking about liberalism. That battle has now been, the horseshoe has now is bending towards holistic completion on this, and there are an enormous number of people. Well, let's put it this way: there are too many people. Whether it's an enormous number, it depends on how much they're being amplified by social media and whatnot. But there are a large number of people in positions of influence and power who now say the Enlightenment itself was bad, that liberalism was bad, right? Deneen's answer to, his position is liberalism failed because it was inevitable that it would fail, that it's inherent to all this. And we don't need to go too deep in the weeds on this because I do this a lot on here. But I'm kind of curious what you guys think about this movement, this intellectual movement, like the seriousness with which you regard it. But also, we're talking about how Americans are just kind of weird, right? We have a cultural thing. How much of American liberalism is actually dependent on Enlightenment ideas in the first place, and how much of it is just, I'm not saying Enlightenment ideas aren't important. They obviously are to me, and they did influence things, and they helped reify things at the time of the founding. I stipulate that. But you talk to Yoram Hazony and some of these people, they think about if they can just simply prove to you that Locke was wrong, then all of a sudden, the average American in Peoria is going to be like, oh, I no longer like my personal freedoms and my sovereignty and my individualism. And it's like, most people don't know who Locke is. Most people don't. This is a culturally transmitted thing, not an intellectually transmitted thing. Anyway, that's my putting my thumb on the scale. What do you think about this sort of post-liberal, anti-liberal, new right kind of movement? And how much do you think the Enlightenment itself is, particularly the French Enlightenment, which a lot of these people like to claim, is essential to the American project?
Yeah. So maybe I'll just start with a comment about Patrick Deneen's book, Why Liberalism Failed, which you mentioned, and how I think that book may have, people who are concerned about that book may have misaimed their response to it. So first of all, we talked to Patrick shortly before the book was published, and he said to us, basically, this is just Tocqueville. Mm-hmm. And when we read the book, we thought, okay, we can kind of see that, but it actually, is like Tocqueville in negative almost. Tocqueville gives a very complex picture of both the strengths and weaknesses, or the opportunities and challenges of American democracy, and Patrick definitely emphasizes kind of the dark side of things. But that's just to contextualize the book. I think a lot of people, at least in our kind of circles, professor circles, punditry circles, that were responding to that book with some irritation, saying like we should not, worried that he had critiqued liberalism in a way that would be really destructive. And I sympathize with those worries. I think a lot of people did actually focus on his chapters on Locke or on the founding. And we're like, that's not really what the founding was about, right? They may have very good, solid arguments about that. But I think precisely for the reasons you mentioned, most people in this country are not actually disputing about whether the founders read more Locke or Montesquieu, right? I mean, there's an answer to that, but that's not what's keeping people up at night. I think the most important chapter in that book, or the most effective chapter in that book, I'd say, and this is based on our teaching of it and reading it with young people, it was the anti-culture chapter. Mm-hmm. I think he hit on something there that resonated with them, whether you agree with it or not. I think young people, many of them felt, and probably felt even more powerfully, even more powerfully after COVID, that they were not being introduced into a culture, like a strong culture, or a culture at all in some cases. And they may exaggerate, what is actually the case. We had a student in one of our summer programs say, my generation feels like it has to reinvent culture from scratch. I think that's an exaggeration, but mm-hmm. That totally resonated with the room. Everyone nodded, everyone, sort of hummed a kind of agreement to that. So I think, people of our generation just need to start with that as a kind of fact of the way many people who are at least attracted to Patrick's book among the younger set experience their lives, and try to address it at that level.
I think just to build on what Jenna is saying, I've never been a Lockean. I read some Locke in graduate school, and it just left me cold. Locke's a cold guy. There's no mistaking that. When you take a look at this stuff, and my deepest philosophic allegiances have always been to authors like Plato and Pascal, and with respect to American things like Alexis de Tocqueville, because I find that they just have a kind of psychological richness and warmth and depth and seriousness about the most profound human concerns that I just find much more appealing than I do Locke's particular philosophy. But no one in America has ever asked me to sign my name on the dotted line that says I am a good Lockean and therefore I am a good American. It's perfectly possible to be a Pascalian, Platonist, Tocquevillian lover of America, because our fundamental allegiances are to our laws and our institutions and to our political practices, which are often better in practice than they are in theory. And that's a big part of what Yuval's work is. He points out to us that self-government is a thing you do in practice. And oftentimes you can act together without thinking alike. You don't actually have to have the ideological background that is kind of bringing everybody together. That's not really what matters as a matter of practical politics. What matters is if you can come up with rough consensuses around which people can design courses of action. You have to agree with everything, with everybody about everything. On that point, you don't have to sign on the dotted line of Lockeanism. You have to participate in the American project with your neighbors, with people you disagree with, and find ways of going forward together. And that's perfectly possible without signing on to this particular version of Enlightenment ideology.
I would also add that it is wildly exaggerated the political influence that Locke had on the founders. His heroic contribution was epistemological, right? It was the arguments about ways of knowing and experience and all. We don't have to get into the weeds and all that. I was stunned because I just sort of grew up being poorly trained in civics, I suppose, that I was stunned when I found when I was writing my last book, I was looking for things that the founders said about John Locke, particularly in regard to setting up the Constitution and all. There's just very, very little there, and it doesn't mean he wasn't hugely influential, but like part of the problem was like he was sort of like Abraham Lincoln quotes on the internet. Like people were just ascribing to Locke things that Locke never actually said, as Aristotle said, don't believe everything you read on the internet. But regardless, I agree with you, Jenna, that the Why Liberalism Failed book had bits in it that I think are very defensible, again, directionally. I think some of the things in it were less than entirely defensible. I mean, the utter, I really invoke my feminist card here, but his really blasé attitude towards women, women's emancipation, and basically saying that being able to work is just another kind of incarceration to in the capitalist neoliberal machinery, I thought was kind of a garbage argument. But there were places, I did a couple of events with him when that book came out, and I said, look, there's stuff in here I agree with about like pushing power down to local level, subsidiarity, localism. These things are really important because they give people a sense of agency in their lives, and that's how actual self-government works, is where you're actually in a local community and you know the powers that be and you have influence and persuasion. And so I agree with all that. My problem with these people is more evident in his second book, Regime Change, which, first of all, the use of regime change by people who know better is a real problem in my mind. Like, the regime in our country is the Constitution. And there's a lot of Marxist sort of Leninist cosplay in that book. But my problem with a lot of the post-liberal types and the nationalists, and forget all the labels, is they never want to like take over Rhode Island. It's got to be the whole country, right? They never want to like have a let's kick the tires on this idea of an Aristotelian ultramontane society dedicated to the highest moral good in Yadahay Flats, Nebraska. And let's see, what problems come out of that. And then if it works really well, let's scale it up to all of Nebraska or maybe to Omaha or whatever. They always say, if we can just get in charge of the federal government. And to me, this is a utter negation of both the Enlightenment-based ideas of what America is, but also the cultural-based, the sort of ground-up, groundwater ideas of what America is. And these people should know better.
Yeah, I think there's a question of whether Patrick touched a nerve in that book. He obviously did, and he's obviously reading something really correct when he does that, and whether it was wise to write the book as he did, which I have my severe doubts about. But I would note that Why Liberalism Failed does end on a note of localism, right? The appendix or the epilogue or whatever is about letting 1,000 cultural flowers bloom.
And I agree with that.
I think he was critiqued by people like Adrian Vermeule for being himself liberal in making that recommendation, and then he took a real turn toward the kinds of things you're mentioning. So I think that's important, not just because that's his personal trajectory, but because that's a trajectory of what a lot of young people have gone through, right, or are going through. They're worried about the anti-culture. They do sometimes entertain or often even engage in these kind of local experiments. Many of them long for something like the Benedict option, right? And some of them do go join intentional communities and build flourishing local lives. I think that's a great option. But a lot of them do look toward something like regime change. But I think the question for us is like how to disrupt that process, right? If we don't feel like that is the right trajectory for young Americans to be on or Americans to be on, how do we attend to the problems of what Patrick calls anti-culture that clearly resonate with an important sector of young Americans and maybe other Americans as well? How do we direct that in a more salutary way?
So, I think what Jenna's saying there just fits in well with the thing that we got worried about in thinking about this next book, and a lot of this comes from our engagement with students. The language that we were using, we were talking a little bit about liberal education earlier. Liberal education as a liberation from unexamined assumptions, from the authority of the past, from some heavy cultural inheritance that is weighing down on you. And this is true. So that probably resonates with some listeners. Understanding of what's going on in left-leaning university classrooms. But that's also true on that description also fits much of the educational right. And so Alan Bloom described liberal education as liberation from the authority of priests, parents, and poets. That has long influence in our intellectual world. But, I look around and you know what? Priests, poets, and parents do not have a whole lot of influence in the lives of a lot of young Americans. And that's precisely what is behind, I think, a lot of the political agitation of our moment. That is, young people feel like all they've inherited is something like an anti-culture. And that makes them feel like their liberty is a curse rather than a blessing. And
I think that's fair.
And that's why Jenna and I wanted to write this book. It's actually not liberal education as liberation from the stuff that you've inherited. It's liberal education as an art of thinking that can help you enjoy being free, that can actually allow being free to seem like a blessing, which we think it is. But it only seems like a blessing if you can actually do something substantive. If you don't just experience it as a totally disorienting world in which you can't possibly find your way, and therefore you just sort of let yourself get pushed around by these larger forces, which is what a lot of young people experience. And that's why the kind of post-liberal recycling of a lot of Marxist tropes really sits with young people is because they see themselves as sort of battered by the forces of global capitalism, as opposed to agents that can actually do something in the world, because their educations haven't helped them become those kinds of agents.
Yeah, I think to go back. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
To go back to the discussion we were having about liberal education and civic education, and how we were saying they've been too dichotomized. Liberal education, at least since the post World War II, has often been glossed as questioning everything, right? Unpacking all of your convention ideas, putting them on the table, and sifting through them. And to quote Yuval again, in the post-war period, Americans had kind of inherited a pretty thick culture, and they were having fun liberalizing. And liberalizing is just not that fun anymore. It's not something that people are looking to do, because they don't feel like they're emerging at 18 with like a whole set of strong institutional they don't feel like they're emerging at 18 with having been formed by a strong set of institutions that they then want to kind of question around the edges. They really feel often quite adrift. And so liberal education, I think, both has to introduce students to something of the culture that they, in fact, are inheriting, right? We haven't done a good job with this in our universities, but our book is really about something we think is equally fundamental, or maybe more fundamental, which is the way that the activities of liberal education can help you learn to navigate what is truly an open field before you. In other words, how liberal education can help you acquire the abilities to be prudent, to engage in questions of practical wisdom, to engage in the kinds of questions, open-ended questions, that are going to confront you as an individual, as someone who wants to create a family, to find a school, to be part of our civic life.
It's funny. In some ways, what you're talking about could be more properly be called small R Republican education, but we're not allowed to use that word very much these days. Hey, last question. I know,
Jonah, that's really important. Actually, that like you see on university campuses, a lot of use of the word democracy, a lot of the use of the word liberal, and these kinds of things. Like just introducing the word Republican as a word that ought to be like revitalized in these kinds of educational contexts. It's actually a really good thing, because it would help the university shed some of this partisan cast that it has taken on, if people were willing to make those kinds of linguistic moves.
I agree with you entirely. Although I was going to, just as a closing question, don't mean to put you on the spot. You can reject it if you want. It's a topic I talk about here a lot. Talk to you all about it a bunch. There is this talking point that you get from a certain tribe of conservative that loves to say with great assurance, we're a republic, not a democracy. And at a superficial level, I agree to a certain extent, right? I mean, there's a real truth in there. I never understand, I always ask them a follow-up question. Okay, so what does that mean, therefore? Like, therefore what to it? And it is one of those phrases that people use, and then you start probing them, and they don't actually have a really good understanding of what a republic is. And so I'm just kind of curious how you guys would answer the question, what's the difference between a republic and a democracy?
I think our objection to I have a similar kind of objection to the overuse of the very term democracy. It's often put on a kind of as the sort of angels of light party compared to the angels of darkness party of authoritarianism. My objection to this is actually just more of an intellectual objection, which is just, this is a really inadequate hermeneutic for understanding the very strange world in which we find ourselves. I mean, the ancient political philosophy had a much more complicated typology of regimes. You were walking through this at the beginning of the podcast, Jonah, that like oligarchy means the rule of the few, not necessarily the rule of the rich, and that's an important distinction to understand if you want to see what's actually going on in your organization, in your government, and in whatever it is. And so, my defense of a term like constitutional republicanism or constitutional democracy or something like this would actually be a defense of the complexity for its own sake. That is, that the complexity is good. because we don't, these huge abstractions like democracy, they're not very helpful, and oftentimes they get stuffed with a lot of content that doesn't actually help us advance the political things that we're most concerned with. And so I'm not a big, like, we're a republic, not a democracy, kind of guy, although I understand something of the argument. But I think the sense that we need to refer to ourselves in compound terms, constitutional democracy, liberal democracy, things like this, that's really important. We need to understand why we do that and why we can't simplify it all down to the question of democracy and authoritarianism.
I mean, a lot of authoritarianisms are built upon democratic impulses, for starters, right? I mean, a lot of populist demagogues win elections and then stop having elections. And so, like, this idea that, like, somehow the Republican, the way I talk to people is, like, the Republican stuff is like the checks and balances part. The Republican stuff is this idea that we don't want the Supreme Court, holding an election about your basic, you wouldn't want to have your civil rights as in the Bill of Rights put up for a vote, right? That's the Republican part, right? Is this idea that not everything should be democratized because some things are too important to be democratized. And it's amazing to me how lost on a lot of people all of that is. But anyway,
I think I've heard you all also contrast the term Republican with the term liberal, right? And I think liberal is often about, when you talk about liberalism, you're often talking about what is it we should allow each other to do. In other words, what kind of realm of privacy should we have? What kinds of things should we permit in our society? Whereas when we talk about being members of a republic or even parts of a democracy, we're talking about what should we be doing together? How should we engage with each other? And I think that's part of a larger understanding of the way that we and Yuval see the basic problem today, which is a problem not of overactivity and overzealousness in doing things, but a kind of problem of passivity. Young people in particular, are not really sure how or why they should engage in the world, and we have to actually explain to them the structures our country has set up for them to engage in, and also why it's exciting, good part of your life, part of a flourishing life, to actually engage in your civic culture.
Yeah, just to piggyback on what Jenna was saying there, the question of what we should allow one another to do is obviously an important question. But the more fundamental question, the question that we're more lacking resources on, is what is worth doing in the first place. And that's a lot of what I think Jen and I discovered in different ways in college, and what we're trying to celebrate in this book that we're working on, Why Think. In my own case, I actually discovered the names of the virtues in college. I'd never used words like courage, justice, moderation, and wisdom before I arrived in college. And this is just like a totally obvious part of a cultural inheritance that comes down from the Greeks, that in a certain sense it should have just been there, but it wasn't. And that's where I discovered it, and it really helped with respect to the project of trying to build a life that seemed worthwhile. And so those are the kinds of things that we hope we can encourage colleges to start re-emphasizing. They have some real treasures that their country would really appreciate if they offered to us again. And we think they can do that without, which would be a profound reform, but wouldn't require them to give up anything of their essential character and mission.
Yeah, we're calling the next book that we're working on writing Why Think, because we think this is the question that professors and university leaders really need to answer. It's a question they have largely overlooked. They've been intoning for quite a long time that they will not teach young people what to think, but they'll just teach them how to think. And I think teaching someone how to think is far more complex than maybe they're even realizing when they proclaim that statement. But they're also missing the question of motivation, right? They're missing the fundamental question that young people are coming in with. Why should I do this? Why should I go through these gen ed requirements? What should I be looking for out of my 4 years here? And we're trying to concentrate people's attention on that question.
All right, I've abused your time, but thank you very much for doing this. When your book comes out, I hope you'll come back, if not sooner. And thank you for doing this.
Yeah, thank you, Jonah. This was fun.
Thanks very much, Jonah.